Imagine a woman so admired that poets stopped mid-sentence when she entered a room, that painters reached for her face long after she was gone, and that an entire city mourned her as though it had lost something it could not name. She was 22 years old when her life ended, and she had lived in Florence for barely 5 years. Tonight I am here with Rowan Hardsteel.
Good evening, Clara.
A woman who was celebrated in life but became truly powerful only in death, when her image was folded into art, myth, and the Renaissance ideal of eternal beauty. Tonight, we turn to a figure who was transformed from a person into a symbol, and who remains one of the most mysterious presences in the history of Western art. The question tonight is not what she looked like, but what she came to mean.
She was admired by the most powerful men in Florence, believed to have inspired some of the most famous paintings ever made, and she passed away before any of that legacy could be confirmed.
We are speaking about Simonetta Vespucci,
a young noblewoman of 15th century Florence, whose beauty became a mirror for everything the Renaissance most desired, and whose myth has outlasted almost every certainty we have about her life.
Then let us begin with the world she entered, the Florence that made a myth like hers, both necessary and inevitable.
Florence in the second half of the 15th century was unlike anywhere else in Europe. Under the patronage of the Medici family, and particularly under Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, the city had become the intellectual and artistic capital of the Western world. Philosophers, poets, painters and sculptors gathered in the same palaces, debating Plato in the afternoon and attending tournaments by evening.
So beauty was not merely admired, it was a philosophical concern.
Exactly. The humanists of Florence, influenced by the Neoplatonic thought being revived by thinkers like Marsilio Ficino, believed that physical beauty was a reflection of divine harmony. To gaze upon true beauty was not a frivolous act. It was, in their framework, a form of ascent toward the ideal. The ancient Greeks had believed the same. And in Renaissance Florence, Greece was being born again.
So into this world came a young woman from Genoa.
Yes, Simonetta Cattaneo was born around 1453 in Genoa, into a family of respectable but modest standing. In 1469 she married Marco Vespucci, a young Florentine nobleman, and came to live in Florence. The Vespucci family had close ties to the Medici, which placed the young couple immediately within the innermost circle of Florentine society.
So she arrived already connected to the most powerful family in the city.
Yes, and her arrival did not go unnoticed. Contemporary accounts described the effect she had on people as something close to astonishment. Poets wrote of her almost immediately. Courtiers sought her attention. What is striking is that even those who wrote about her before any particular fame had attached itself to her name already, reached for extraordinary language.
So the response was immediate, almost involuntary.
Yes, and here is where the myth begins to separate from the woman, because what we have are not portraits drawn from observation. What we have are projections, men writing what they wanted to see, and then attributing it to her. Simonetta Vespucci was not just admired, she was constructed. The Florentine elite needed an ideal, and she provided the occasion for one.
So the real Simonetta was already being replaced by an idea of Simonetta.
Exactly. And this process accelerated dramatically with the joust of 1475. Giuliano de' Medici, the younger brother of Lorenzo the Magnificent, was one of the most celebrated young men in Florence, handsome, athletic, and deeply admired. In that year's great jousting tournament, Giuliano entered the field carrying a banner painted by Botticelli himself, depicting Simonetta Vespucci as Pallas Athena, the goddess of wisdom. On the banner were inscribed the words, La Sans Pareille, the incomparable.
So in a single public ceremony, she was declared incomparable, and given the face of a goddess.
Yes, and Giuliano won the tournament. Whether there was a genuine romantic attachment between him and Simonetta remains unknown. She was a married woman. He was not her husband. The precise nature of their connection has never been confirmed. What we know is that the admiration was public, celebrated, and entirely sanctioned by the culture of courtly love that Florentine elite society had borrowed from medieval tradition.
So admiring another man's wife was not scandal, it was poetry.
Exactly, and Simonetta, already an ideal, was about to become permanently unattainable.
She passed away the following year.
Yes, in April of 1476, Simonetta Vespucci passed away from what contemporary sources describe as a rapid illness of the lungs, almost certainly tuberculosis. She was approximately 22 years old. Lorenzo de' Medici, wrote a poem in her memory. The city held a public procession. Accounts describe people weeping openly in the streets.
So Florence mourned her, not as a private person, but as a collective loss.
Yes, and this is the paradox at the heart of her story. Her death did not diminish her. It completed the myth. She would never age, she would never disappoint, she would never be seen in an ordinary moment that reduced her to a person rather than an ideal. She passed away at the exact moment when she was most beautiful in the imagination of those who loved her.
So death fixed her permanently, in the form they needed her to hold.
Exactly, and no one understood this more deeply than Sandro Botticelli. Botticelli had been present in that world. He had painted the banner for the joust. He had moved in the same Medici circles, and in the years following her passing, a recurring female face began to appear across his most important works.
So the connection between Botticelli and Simonetta is real, but also complicated.
It is, and this is the myth-busting moment that the story demands. There is no documented proof that Simonetta Vespucci ever posed for Botticelli. No contract, no letter, no contemporary account explicitly states that the Venus in The Birth of Venus is her. The Birth of Venus was painted around 1484 or 85, which is approximately 8 years after Simonetta passed away.
So she could not have posed for it in any direct sense.
She could not. What is far more likely is that Botticelli carried a memory of her, or an image of her, and that this image became part of his internal vocabulary for female beauty. It is also worth noting that noblewomen of her standing simply did not pose nude for painters. That was not how Renaissance art was modeled. The nude figures in Botticelli's works were not portraits of living women. They were philosophical constructions built from classical sources, studio models of low social standing, and the painter's own creative imagination.
So, the Venus emerging from the sea was never meant to be a record of a real person.
Never. And understanding this requires understanding how Renaissance artists thought about beauty itself. The ancient Greeks had a concept they called the ideal form. The notion that any beautiful individual thing was a partial, imperfect reflection of a perfect beauty that existed beyond the physical world. When a Greek sculptor carved Aphrodite, he was not carving a woman he had seen. He was carving the idea of the goddess, assembled from the best features of many women, but transcending all of them.
So Venus was never a woman. She was always a concept.
Exactly, and here it becomes necessary to address a persistent confusion that has followed Simonetta's name into popular culture. Some accounts have suggested a connection between Simonetta Vespucci and the Venus de Milo, the famous ancient Greek marble sculpture, now in the Louvre. This connection is impossible. The Venus de Milo was carved in ancient Greece approximately between 100 and 150 years before the Common Era, nearly 2,000 years before Simonetta was born.
So, the two are separated by almost 2 millennia.
Yes, the confusion arises partly because both are associated with Venus, and partly because myth-making has a tendency to collapse time. When we wish to believe that a real woman inspired an eternal image, we sometimes extend that belief further than the evidence can carry it to. But the confusion also points to something true. Botticelli was deeply influenced by ancient Greek and Roman sculpture, and the Venus he painted owes more to those classical sources than to any living model.
So Botticelli was in conversation with antiquity, not just with the Florence around him.
Exactly. He had studied ancient sculptures, ancient coins, ancient reliefs, the pose of his Venus, that slight tilt of the head, the cascade of hair, the gesture of the hands. All of these echo specific ancient models that had been studied and revered by Florentine humanists. What Botticelli added was something entirely his own, a quality of melancholy, a sense that this perfect beauty was also infinitely fragile.
So his Venus looks as though she already knows she will not stay.
Yes, and that quality may be precisely where Simonetta enters, not as a model, but as a feeling. Botticelli had known her, or at least moved in the world she briefly illuminated. He had watched that world grieve her. When he painted a goddess of beauty arriving on the shore of the world, he may have painted with that grief still inside him.
So Simonetta may have given Botticelli not a face, but a tone.
That is perhaps the most accurate way to understand it. What we know with more certainty is that a certain face appears with notable consistency across his major works from the 1480s onward. In The Birth of Venus, in Primavera, in various Madonna paintings, the same general features recur: an oval face, a long neck, heavy-lidded eyes with a quality of distant contemplation, Whether this is the face of Simonetta, the face of an unnamed studio model, or simply Botticelli's own internalized ideal, no document has yet resolved.
So the face we all think we recognize may always remain unverified.
Yes, and there is one final detail that has sustained the belief in Botticelli's attachment. Giorgio Vasari, the 16th century artist and biographer who chronicled the lives of Italian painters, wrote that Botticelli requested in his will to be buried at the feet of a woman named Simonetta. Some have interpreted this as the Simonetta Vespucci. Others believe it referred to another woman entirely, but if the identification is correct, then Botticelli carried her memory for more than 35 years after her life ended, and chose to spend eternity beside her.
So memory, in his case, may have lasted longer than the myth did for everyone else.
Yes. And this brings us to the deeper philosophical question her story raises. What happens to a person when they become a symbol? Simonetta Vespucci was a real woman. She had a husband, a household, daily experiences we know nothing about. She almost certainly had fears, preferences, opinions, and days when she felt ordinary. None of that survived. What survived was the projection, the ideal, the incomparable.
So the real person was erased by the very admiration that claimed to honor her.
Exact. This is not unique to Simonetta. The Renaissance was full of women whose names attached to great works but whose actual lives vanished behind them. The obsession with eternal beauty that drove Neoplatonic thought required its ideals to be fixed, unchanging, and beyond the reach of ordinary time. A living woman, growing older, changing, expressing disagreement, having preferences of her own, could not serve that function. Only an image could get.
So the transformation from person to symbol required the elimination of everything that made her specifically herself.
Yes. Yes is the conclusion her story insists upon. That Simonetta Vespucci was not immortalized because of who she was. She was immortalized because of what she came to represent. And when beauty becomes an idea, the person disappears. The myth remains endlessly reproduced, endlessly projected onto new surfaces, carrying less and less of the original life that gave it its first occasion.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to understand the world that shaped Simonetta and the art she is believed to have inspired, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Botticelli, Life and Work by Ronald Lightbound.
So this is a study of the painter himself rather than of Simonetta specifically.
It is a detailed and authoritative study of Botticelli's life and art, offering deep insight into the cultural world that shaped his work and the figures believed to have inspired it. Lightbound is rigorous about what can be confirmed and what cannot, which makes it one of the most reliable guides to understanding how myth and history have intertwined in this story.
Is it accessible to a reader who is new to Renaissance art?
It is scholarly in its depth, and it rewards patient reading rather than quick consumption. But it is also beautifully illustrated, and even a reader without specialized knowledge will come away with a much richer understanding of what Botticelli was actually doing and why.
So reading it gives you the art and the world behind it together.
Precise, and that context is exactly what allows you to understand why Simonetta became what she became.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The immediate legacy of Simonetta's myth was felt first within the circle of Florentine humanists who had known her, or known of her. Poliziano, the great poet of the Medici court, wove her name and her image into his verse. Lorenzo de' Medici's own sonnets circled around the figure of a lost and incomparable beauty. She became the organizing principle of an aesthetic moment, the hewn occasion for ideas that the culture had been trying to express.
So even in death she was doing cultural work she had not been asked to do.
Yes, and then Botticelli's great paintings arrived and the myth hardened into image. The Birth of Venus, painted in the early 1480s, became one of the most reproduced images in human history. By the time scholars began seriously studying the painting in the 19th and 20th centuries, the association with Simonetta was already so embedded in popular imagination that it was nearly impossible to dislodge.
So the myth had become the history, even for those who should have known better.
Exactly, and this reveals something important about how the Renaissance itself has been remembered. The 19th century, which rediscovered Botticelli with enormous enthusiasm after centuries of relative neglect, was itself obsessed with the idea of a golden age of beauty. The The pre-Raphaelite painters in England, the aesthetic movement, the whole current of late Victorian Romanticism found in Botticelli's Venus exactly what they were looking for, and in finding it, they projected their own desires backward onto the Renaissance, strengthening the story of Simonetta as the original muse.
So each era that admired Botticelli also added another layer to the myth.
Yes, the story of Simonetta Vespucci is not just a Renaissance story. It is a story about how every age constructs its ideals. Every culture needs figures that embody what it most desires, and it tends to find them, or to build them, from the material of real people who happen to be present at the right moment. The critiques of this process are well founded. A real woman was absorbed into a cultural apparatus that had no interest in her as an individual.
So, the very celebration was also an erasure.
Yes, and this tension has not resolved. Today, when her name trends in connection with articles about Renaissance beauty standards, or when her supposed face appears in cosmetics advertising, the same mechanism is at work. A real person is being used to carry an idea, and the person herself is still not there. What Simonetta's story offers us, if we are willing to look carefully, is a way of recognizing this pattern wherever it appears.
So her most enduring lesson may be one she never intended to give her.
Yes, she teaches us to ask whenever we encounter an idealized figure, what real person was here, and what of them has been lost in the making of the image. Simonetta Vespucci was not immortalized because of who she was, but because of what she came to represent. And when beauty becomes an idea, the person disappears. The myth remains.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the life, the myth, and the long afterlife of the most celebrated face in Renaissance Florence.
She arrived in a city that was hungry for beauty, and she gave it something to hold. That she could not control what was held in her name is perhaps the oldest story in the history of art.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.